Hey there, we are back to 17.3 angle relationships. In the last video, you talked about the definitions of the adjacent angles, vertical angles, transversal angles, and corresponding angles. So now we're putting it all together and trying to find the angles giving the items. Okay? So here we have line N and line P. So those are two parallel lines, and they are cut by a transversal. So our transversal is right here. When you notice that when we have a line and a transversal cuts it, it creates 4 angles. So we have another line with transversal, so we have a total of 8 different angles here. Out of these 8 angles, if we know one of the measures, we can find all of the other measures of the angles by using our vocabulary words that we just used. So we're going to find here angles 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 based on knowing that this angle right here is 50 degrees and this angle is 130 degrees. When you find all these angles, there are only 2 answers, 50 degrees or 130 degrees. So all of these angles 1 through 6, it's either going to be 130 degrees or 50 degrees. Okay, so those are the only 2 answers you're going to have for all of them. So let's start with angle 1 here. How can I find the measure of angle 1? Well, we have what's called adjacent angles. Mr. Hughes talked about adjacent angles are people that are next to you, your neighbors, right? Adjacent angles equal 180 degrees. So if angle 1 and 130 degrees are adjacent to each other, they're just split by a line. Kind of think about neighbors. Maybe you have a fence in between you, right? If you have a fence in between there, you're next door, so you have to equal 180. So I can subtract 180 from 130 to measure angle 1. So angle 1 and angle 130 are adjacent angles. So 180 minus 130 gives you 50 degrees. So the measure of angle 1 is 50 degrees. All right, let's try angle 2 now. So now we know this is 130 degrees and angle 1 is 50 degrees. All right, so how can I find angle 2? Well, there's lots of different ways. Measure of angle 2 here, we can use what's called vertical angles this time. Vertical angles are angles that are across from each other. They only have to cross that middle point where they connect there. They are across the street from each other. Vertical angles are congruent. So if they're across from each other, they are equal. So if across the street here is 130 degrees, angle 2 is also 130 degrees. There are other ways you can find this. We just found measure of angle 1 is 50. We could also use the adjacent angles. 1 and 2 are next door to each other, and we could subtract 180 minus 50 and also get 130. So there is more than one way to find the angles. Angle 3. All right, knowing angle 3. Angle 3 is next to the angle 130 degrees. They are called adjacent angles, right? So if they're adjacent angles, I can subtract 180 minus 130 to get 50 degrees. Also, since we know that we have obtuse angles, 130 degrees, and we found measure of angle 1 was acute angle, it was 50 degrees, we can also look and say, whoa, all the acute angles in this figure are going to be congruent, right? So if they're congruent, I know that they all have to be 50 degrees. All the obtuse angles are going to be 130 degrees. So that's another way to look at to find all of these items. All right, angle 4. Angle 4 over here now, I can use this 50 degrees to help us out. 50 degrees and measure of angle 4, they're neighbors. Those are called adjacent angles, right? So we can go ahead and subtract 180 minus 50 to get us 130 degrees. Angle 4 also, we can also say, hey, this is our obtuse angle, right? That's a very large angle. All obtuse angles in this picture are going to be 130 degrees. Measure of angle 4 is obtuse, so that's 130 degrees. Measure of angle 5. All right, so we're over here. We can use the 50 degrees and measure of angle 5. They're across from each other. Those are called vertical angles. So if they're vertical, that means they're congruent. So if this is 50 degrees, angle 5 is also 50 degrees, right? Angle 5 is also an acute angle. So we know that all acute angles in this picture are going to be 50 degrees. So more than one way to find them. Angle 6 then. Our last angle. Angle 6 and angle 4. They're vertical angles. They're across from each other. Vertical angles are congruent. We found angle 4 a couple examples ago, and we said that angle 4 was 130 degrees. So if that's 130, we know 6 is also 130 degrees. 6 is an obtuse angle, right? And so we know that all obtuse angles in this picture are also 130 degrees. So lots of different ways to find measures of angles.
Alrighty, let's go through another example. Here we have two parallel lines, N and P, with a transversal going through them. And we end up with 8 different angles. We have one of the angles, angle 1 at 45 degrees. And we have angle 8 at 135 degrees. And as Mrs. Peterson said, we can find out using vertical angles. We can find the other angles using corresponding angles, or adjacent angles, I should say, and you can do it using corresponding angles because we know that angle 1 at 45 degrees is equal to the corresponding angle 5 right here. Or we can look at and notice that there's only 2 measures that are in this entire diagram that are given. 45 degrees, and that's for all of the acute angles. All of them. That would be number 1, number 5, number 7, number 3. And all of the obtuse angles would be 135 degrees. 6, 2, and 4. So let's kind of work through these. Angle 2. We know it's adjacent to angle 1, next to. So we can take the adjacent formula of 180 degrees because it's supplementary, and subtract the 45, and we're going to get angle 2 to be 135 degrees, which matches the obtuse of angle 8 at 135 degrees. Angle 3, again, being a vertical angle to angle 1, is automatically going to be congruent, which means it's 45 degrees. So we know that vertical angles are congruent, so they're equal in size. Angle 4, again, we found out that angle 2 was adjacent to angle 1, and that was 135 degrees. So its vertical angle across from it is also going to be an obtuse angle at 135 degrees. So we'll take angle 4 plus the 145. We can go adjacent here, and we get 180. So it's going to equal 145 degrees, or 135 degrees. Continuing on with angle 5, we've got the adjacent angle of 135. We take the 135 and we subtract that from 180, and we're going to end up with our 45 degree angle that matches all the other acute angles in the diagram. Angle 6 is a vertical angle to 135 to angle 8. So we know that 135 angle 8 degrees is equal to the angle 6 at 135 degrees as well. Angle 7, I think, is our last angle. Again, we can do this a couple different ways. One, we know we found angle 5 to be 45 degrees. We know that vertically from it or opposite is congruent at 45 degrees. Or we can find adjacent next to each other, 180 minus 35, and we're going to get angle 7 to be 45 degrees. Ladies and gentlemen, your assignment for this evening, or today, is worksheet 17.3. It is a handout that you should be given, separate from your notes this time. Just a reminder that tomorrow we will have a homework check. Have a good day.